3 de la tarde. Estos son los exiliados, transmitiendo a través del 95.3 FM para toda Zipaquirá, Sabana Norte, Sabana Centro, para todas aquellas personas que hasta ahora se conectan a través de nuestras redes sociales y a todos a quienes nos escuchan en el www.colombiamigrate.com. Ahí también nos pueden encontrar. Así que estos son los exiliados y le vamos a dar de una vez la bienvenida a la señorita Elizabeth Cohen, quien es profesora de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Syracuse. Así que Riley, por favor, saluda a su invitada.
Dr. Cohen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we are going to principally discuss your recent book, Illegal: How America's Lawless Immigration Regime Threatens Us All. So my first question is, what got you interested in immigration policy as a subject in the first place?
Well, several things got me interested. First of all, I am the daughter of an immigrant, so it's part of my biography to be concerned about immigration. And also, since, I would say the late 1990s, we've had a really growing immigration enforcement bureaucracy in the United States that I think poses a really big threat to everybody in the country and plenty of people outside the country. So I wanted to share what I saw as a looming problem.
Bueno, muy bien. La pregunta que hacía Riley es, ¿cuál fue su verdadero interés acerca de lo que tiene que ver con la legislación de la migración a los Estados Unidos? La señorita Cohen nos decía que pues, es algo que la atrae mucho, que es de su gran interés la inmigración. Desde los años 90 ha visto cómo ha crecido día a día la burocracia de la migración hacia los Estados Unidos y lo ha visto también como una amenaza tanto interna como externa para el país.
Okay, so in your book you write quite a bit about immigration enforcement agencies in the United States, such as CBP and ICE. Now, towards the beginning of the book, you write that even though undocumented immigration has decreased in recent years, funding for immigration enforcement agencies has gone up dramatically. In your research, what explanations do you find for this phenomenon?
Right. So since about 2007, 2008, immigration, particularly undocumented immigration to the United States, has been going down. And most of the undocumented immigrants in the U.S. are older and have been here longer. Despite that, there have been dramatic increases, exponential increases in the amount of money the country is spending and the types of methods that are being used to incarcerate and expel people. The explanation that I would give for this is that the agencies themselves have been trying to expand with little respect for what is actually happening in the country for immigration and in an attempt to gain power for themselves. So this is a bureaucratic problem.
Muy bien, una de las preguntas que hacía Riley es ¿por qué ha crecido o ha venido aumentando el presupuesto en las agencias de inmigración, agencias como ICE? Nos dice la señorita Cohen que desde el 2007, aunque la inmigración ha bajado en los Estados Unidos, se ha visto como exponencialmente los presupuestos se han aumentado y también de acuerdo con el crecimiento de los presupuestos también la gente que ha sido deportada del país. Sí, y ha crecido la falta de respeto por la gente. Y en esto vemos es como las agencias tratando de no solo adquirir más presupuesto, también quieren adquirir más poder en cuanto a las otras agencias de los Estados Unidos.
Okay, Next question is, what misconceptions would you say many Americans have about immigration?
So first of all, think that you know, part of what's going on right now is the growth of white nationalism, and there are a lot of people who have misconceptions about kind of the history of immigration in the country and whether when they arrived they were considered white, which in almost all cases is no. But also I think people have a lot of misconceptions about whether it is not their problem. So lots of citizens think that they can't be hurt by these very large, very well-armed organizations like ICE and CBP. In fact, US citizens can be incarcerated, they can be pulled off the street, they can be questioned, and in some cases they can even be deported, although it should not legally be possible. We've seen cases of deportation of US citizens. It's also the case that there is a kind of simultaneous campaign to denationalize some naturalized citizens. So I think a really common misconception is that this is only being affecting people who are somehow wrong or criminals or don't belong in the country, and that's not true.
Muy bien, se le hacía la pregunta acerca de cuáles son esos errores o esa concepción errónea que se tienen acerca de la inmigración, y pues nos contesta la doctora Cohen que primero que todo estamos atravesando en una era de nacionalismo. Vemos cómo se desconoce la historia acerca de la inmigración, cómo las personas como tal, las personas legales en el país ven que no es un gran problema que las agencias actúen, agencias como ICE o CBP, que actúan dentro de su propia ley, de cierta manera tirando personas de la calle, interrogándolas y deportándolas, lo cual es completamente ilegal. Así que simultáneamente también han arrancado una campaña para, de cierta manera, desnaturalizar a las personas que son inmigrantes en los Estados Unidos.
Okay, so again, regarding the enforcement agencies, what level of accountability is there for organizations like CBP and ICE?
So the word I used most frequently in the book, and I hope this translates well, is impunity. It means that very often there is almost no accountability. Inspectors general can give reports, but the reports never yield any type of actions on the part even of the head of the Department of Homeland Security, which is a very high level position. It's also the case that it takes a while for the courts to act, and in some cases the agencies don't obey judges' orders. So very little accountability in that kind of hierarchy, and very little, much less scrutiny in hiring practices. So the people who get hired also do not have to undergo as rigorous screening as one would expect for, in many cases, heavily.
Ok, la pregunta que se hacía es ¿a quiénes corresponden o a quiénes se reportan las agencias de inmigración como CBP y ICE? Y nos decía que de cierta manera hay una casi que total impunidad ante lo que son a quién reportan estas agencias, sus acciones. Digámoslo así, responden de una manera muy baja, sobre todo también en lo que tiene que ver con las prácticas de reclutamiento y de cuando se hace el reclutamiento también, como la manera de mirar a quienes se contratan estas agencias, a quienes se reportan estas agencias más bien.
Okay. Now, the United States has long been thought of as a nation of immigrants. Now, your book does not deal just with immigration policy now. It also deals with immigration policy in the past. How has American policy regarding immigrants evolved really over the past century or so?
Yeah, so I start the book by talking about the first penalties the country created, making it technically illegal to be in the country without proper authorization. That was 1929. And we've kind of gone through periods that were very restrictive, including the 1920s through the 1960s, and periods that were more open. The one constant I can say is that there has been a long-standing presence of resistance to immigrants being in the US, and that presence or that resistance was often rooted in beliefs about white nationalism, that the United States is a white nation, and certain kinds of white supremacy. So there's a consistent pushback even before the 1920s to the idea that immigrants would be coming in from countries that weren't thought of as white.
Muy bien, la pregunta que se le hacía a la doctora Cohen es ¿cómo ha evolucionado este sistema de migración? ¿O cómo ha sido la evolución del sistema de migración? Nos decía que al comienzo se tenían como penalidades o se trataba como a una persona ilegal aquella que estaba sin autorización en el país. Esto comenzó sobre todo en 1929 y a través de los años 20 hasta los años 60, donde por así decirlo fue bastante estricta las medidas que se tomaban acerca de los inmigrantes a los Estados Unidos. Luego, a través de los años siempre ha habido una gran presencia o resistencia de las personas hacia los inmigrantes o de los grupos inmigrantes, pero siempre se ha tenido una mentalidad de que los Estados Unidos es un país de blancos y hay se puede decir, un nacionalismo blanco y una supremacía blanca, que son los que, por así decirlo, están muy en contra de la inmigración o de los inmigrantes que viajan a los Estados Unidos. I got a question for Mrs. Cohen. Can you turn on the computer a little bit? Mrs. Cohen, do you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Myself, I was in Afghanistan for 3 years, and when I was in this, going through this process of screening, I find out like I'm a specific type of white. I'm a white Hispanic. It's pretty interesting because sometimes I like to compare myself with Riley, and we're exactly the same kind of white, but the thing is I'm white Hispanic. So I was asking the people doing the screening, what about the Brazilians? They are, they're not Hispanic. They are from Portugal. Well, they're descendants from Portugal, right? So what kind of white they are, right? And how I can be a specific type of white color and white Hispanic.
So the history of the census categories, which is probably what were used to classify you, is a pretty complicated one. And almost everybody who isn't of European origin finds them as problematic as you do, because they do not reflect anybody's lived reality. And in fact, although this is not my area of research, there's some excellent scholarly research comparing the Brazilian and the US censuses, because they are both very interesting cases of racial classification.
Muy bien, le preguntaba a la doctora Cohen acerca de mi caso específico en el cual en Afganistán, en mi proceso de selección, fui clasificado como una categoría de blanco hispánico, blanco iberoamericano, se puede decir, ¿no? Y era muy chistoso porque a todos los que veníamos de Latinoamérica nos clasificaban como blancos hispánicos, pero por ejemplo los brasileros, ellos son descendientes de los portugueses, entonces no serían blancos hispánicos. Y yo les preguntaba a los reclutadores, entonces, ¿cómo hacen con los que vienen de Brasil? Nunca me supieron responder. Y pues nos contesta la doctora Cohen que de cierta manera ellos siempre tratan de clasificar a la gente por su origen europeo, pero el origen europeo no refleja la realidad, aunque ella me asegura que no es el área en el que ella ha tenido esta investigación, pero pues de cierta manera es una manera más de clasificar o de categorizar a las personas en los Estados Unidos.
I think Sebastian has a question.
Yeah, nice to meet you. I have a question.
Likewise.
How do officials keep track in how many people are in the United States legally?
So usually the estimations of the undocumented presence is extracted from, in some cases, some census data and from other types of population estimates, but they are always estimates. They're pretty good. Social scientists, demographers are pretty good at making those estimates. And as Riley said, the numbers have been going down for quite some time. But yeah, but census and then some state and local demographic information are used for estimates.
Bien, la pregunta que hacía Sebastián es ¿cómo se rastrea la cantidad de ilegales en los Estados Unidos? Nos dice la doctora Cohen que generalmente son extractos de estimados en los que trabajan, por así decirlo, demógrafos o investigadores sociales. Pero como decía Riley, los números han venido decayendo últimamente. I have another question for Dr. Cohen. My question is, why people from Guam or any other U.S. territory, they must serve in the military, but they are not able to vote, or they can't vote? How this thing works? Because I know they have American passport, but they don't have a nationality, but they have to be in the army. So how this thing works?
So I missed just the very first part of your question, but you said people who are in the army from where?
From like Guam or from any other U.S. territory?
Yes, Guam and Puerto Rico, right. So the rule about people who are residents of U.S. territories is that they can come to mainland United States, and when they are on mainland United States, which is any of the 50 states, they're eligible to vote. But if you're, say, in Puerto Rico and you're physically present in Puerto Rico, then you are not entitled to vote. So the rule is you have to be on mainland. It's a highly problematic artifact of colonialism, of empire, and that's the rule. One must be on mainland.
Ok, la pregunta que le hacía a la doctora Cohen es ¿por qué, por ejemplo, los residentes de los territorios de los Estados Unidos como Puerto Rico, Guam, creo que también las Maldivas, ¿no? ¿Ustedes tienen islas en las Maldivas, no? ¿No? Ok. ¿Por qué no pueden votar? Nos explica la doctora Cohen que solo los residentes en el territorio de los Estados Unidos, en el territorio propio de los 50 estados, tienen derecho a votar. La gente que está en Puerto Rico o en otros territorios alejados que no son parte de los 50 estados no tienen este derecho. Dice que es algo como muy del tiempo, como muy del imperio, si se puede decir.
So, to sort of bring to bring it back to the subject of immigration enforcement, you write in the book, and to sort of bring it sort of back to the white nationalist angle, you write in the book about the relationship, the troublesome relationship between immigration enforcement agencies and citizen militias. Can you talk about what that relationship is?
Yeah, so Customs and Border Protection is an agency that does most of the actual border policing, but everybody needs to understand that their jurisdiction, where they're allowed to act, is any point from an external border of the United States 100 miles in. 2/3 of the US population is in that zone. So it's most people in that zone, but particularly really once you get close to the border, there are, have formed a number of citizen militias, we call them. They're often armed. They tend to kind of come close to impersonating law enforcement agents, but they are not. They're simply ordinary people dressed up that way, and in some cases intimidating whoever they run across. And there's ample evidence that Customs and Border Protection sometimes shares information and in those sorts of ways cooperates with these citizen militias, which is entirely illegal, incredibly dangerous, and shows that the agency is itself sympathetic to what are white nationalist organizations. So it not only is kind of technically illegal, but it also shows a mentality.
Muy bien, preguntaba Riley acerca de la relación entre las milicias ciudadanas y las agencias de protección de frontera como la Customs Border Protection, CBP, ¿cómo funciona esa relación de el cruce de información o de cooperación? Ella dice que el sistema de protección de fronteras está clasificado para proteger las fronteras externas o internas a través de los a no más de 100 kilómetros de la frontera, que es donde la mayoría de personas viven en los Estados Unidos. También dice que estas milicias ciudadanas no representan a las agencias de protección debidamente de la ley. Son gente ordinaria, armada, que simplemente participa intimidando a personas o a cruzantes o a inmigrantes. Y muchas veces estas agencias comparten información, hasta cooperan, pero esto de cierta manera es muy ilegal y completamente peligroso. También apunta la doctora que es la manera como el supremacismo blanco opera con estas milicias ciudadanas, si se puede decir así.
Now, something else that you've written about in the book is regards where these agencies are operative and where abuses take place. Now, I used to live in Bellingham, Washington, which is very close to the Canadian border. And nobody there lives in fear of CBP or ICE. They think that all of that is on the southern border. Yet in your book, you write that that's not the case. Can you talk a bit about how widespread these kinds of actions are?
Yeah, so first of all, I've spent time in Bellingham. It's beautiful. And the northern border in general is kind of imagined to be a place where there's not a lot of activity on the part of Customs and Border Protection. I spend some of my time in upstate New York, which is also near the Canadian border. And if you go to my bus station, my train station, where anybody who might want to, say, take a bus to New York City would go, Customs and Border Protection is there interrogating people all the time. We also have farms, plenty of farms in Washington state as well, especially once you get north of Seattle and east. We have dairy farms in upstate New York, and the dairy farms get raided all the time by CBP looking to find undocumented immigrants to harass people. Sometimes they are doing so legally and they have a lot of leeway. I talk about the ways in which Customs and Border Protection is exempted from certain parts of the US Constitution that are meant to protect people from unlawful searches and seizures. Sometimes they're lawful because they have so much leeway. They also do things in their searches sometimes that are unlawful.
Muy bien, Riley preguntaba acerca de que él vive en Bellingham, es en el estado de Washington, en la frontera norte que bordea a los Estados Unidos con Canadá, y pues su apreciación personal es que nunca sintió miedo de las agencias de inmigración, como CBP. Obviamente, pues Riley es un tricitico blanco y no tiene por qué tener miedo, pero sin embargo, nos decía la doctora Cohen que ella también tuvo un tiempo para estar en Bellingham, que es más o menos de donde viene nuestro queridísimo Rayito de Sol, y nos dice que en su libro ella trataba que la frontera norte también tiene, de cierta manera, realiza actividades no muy legales en esta frontera norte, como por ejemplo ella tenía que tomar la estación del tren y veía gente haciendo a estas agencias haciendo interrogatorios, haciendo pesquisas y también en actividades de interdicción de personas, lo cual para ella se le hace totalmente ilegal, siendo una frontera, pues digamos así, que a través de la historia de los Estados Unidos no ha tenido tanto problema de cruce de inmigrantes como la frontera sur.
I think Sebastian has another question.
Yeah. In your opinion, will President Trump's prospect border wall minimize illegal immigration?
There's very little border wall that has been built. It covers only a few hundred miles. It's utterly impossible to believe a border wall could be completed. Almost no new construction has taken place during his presidency. There's been some repair of old walls, and of course some things that have gone up have fallen down. Do I think that a border wall would do anything to discourage unauthorized crossings into the United States? I do not think that. First of all, we have plenty of evidence that people, when confronted with a wall, either damage the wall or find other ways into the country. But it's also really important to understand that about 40% of the undocumented people in the United States did not cross without authorization. They came legally with permission and overstayed a visa. And it is inconceivable that the country's economy could survive without workers who come from outside the United States. So long term, there will be, I'm almost positive, I don't think this is good, but there will be short-term workers. And some of those people intentionally or unintentionally will overstay their visas. So my answer to the question is no.
Muy bien, pregunta Sebastián acerca de si la construcción del muro que nos decía el presidente Trump podría minimizar el cruce de inmigrantes. Nos dice la autora que primero que todo se le hace imposible que se termine o que se complete este muro. No se ha evidenciado una construcción nueva de este muro. No cree que el muro vaya a cambiar la mentalidad del migrante, porque de cierta manera va a tratar de encontrar una nueva vía por donde pasar. Y por el lado americano nos dice que es muy complicado para que la economía sobreviva sin trabajadores, y no lo ve como algo positivo, más bien lo ve como algo negativo, porque de cierta manera los Estados Unidos también necesitan trabajadores de término corto o de corto término que ayuden a la economía o que entren en función de la economía. I have another question for Dr. Cohen, and it's when start this kind of change of mentality? I remember in the Obama's administration, most of the time people were pretty proud of the country made out of the immigrants, and now everything changed in the Trump's administration, and it's more like nationalist than I mean, the crowd is based on nationalism than it was in the time of Obama. What do you think about it?
Yeah. So I don't want to disagree. There's a lot more nationalist rhetoric right now, and Trump's has been successful at ending a lot of ways of legally entering the country. But President Obama earned the nickname Deporter-in-Chief because he deported huge numbers of people from the United States, particularly in his first term in office. He was not somebody who a lot of immigrants thought was particularly progressive. And before that, there was an attempt by President Bush to create an amnesty, but that was unpopular with his party. Before that, we had President Clinton, who was extremely hard on immigrants and interested in, he was very supportive of creating opportunities for mass deportation. So I think you have to look back to the 1980s to see an environment in which there was kind of widespread opportunities for people to have legal status in the United States.
Muy bien, la pregunta era la siguiente: ¿por qué cambió la mentalidad de los Estados Unidos cuando en los 90s, perdón, en la administración de Obama aún se sentía el orgullo de ser inmigrante, de tener un país de inmigrantes? Y ahora tenemos una administración bajo el presidente Trump que es bastante nacionalista. Ella nos comentaba que ha sido como una especie de proceso, porque en la administración del presidente Bush, digamos que no fue muy popular cuando el presidente Bush trató de hacer una amnistía para inmigrantes. Sin embargo, antes del presidente Bush estuvo el presidente Clinton, quien también fue una de las personas que, digámoslo así, prestó un apoyo para deportaciones masivas. Sin embargo, en los 80s se vio, digámoslo así, como una gran migración, o digamos que la migración no fue tan mal vista durante los años 80.
Okay. I think that we have time for one more question. This last one pertains to Colombia. As you probably know, Colombia's closest neighbor, Venezuela, is going through a major humanitarian crisis, and millions of people have been fleeing the country over the past few years. And the better part of them have ended up here in Colombia. These refugees fleeing from poverty, starvation, and an increasingly authoritarian ruling regime. And they haven't always received a warm welcome either from the Colombian government or Colombian citizens. Now, what lessons can Colombians learn from both the good and the bad of how the United States has received immigrants?
So I think there tends to be real sympathy to panic in moments when there are when there's mass movement. So you know, immigration is not like other types of changes where you can actually predict exactly what's going to happen and keep things very regular and controlled. But human movement, first of all, I think we should treat free movement as a right. People usually don't move unless they absolutely need to because the costs, both personal and economic, are so high. I think that the United States has at a few points been a place where refugees could be resettled. We've never taken proportionately as many as other countries, but I think that so I don't think there's a lot of great lessons to take from the United States, but the moments in which we have been willing to take refugees have often yielded a great supply of talent, of work, and energy. And if people learn to expect that flows of people do not happen in precisely the same number every year, and that sometimes they're going to be higher and lower, they can prepare and find ways to accommodate people who actually do need to leave where they are.
Muy bien, Ralias preguntaba acerca de la situación que tiene Colombia en este momento en cuanto a lo que es la gran migración venezolana, quienes huyen del hambre y la miseria de la situación económica de su país. Y la pregunta es, ¿qué lecciones podemos tener, buenas o malas, de los Estados Unidos? Nos decía la doctora Cohen que de cierta manera no hay buenas lecciones que podamos aprender. Sin embargo, los movimientos humanos se hacen por alguna razón. No es porque el humano como tal quiera emigrar de la noche a la mañana, sino como siempre hay un factor que empuja al inmigrante. Lo que ella recomendaría es que se haga un lugar proporcionado para los refugiados, ya que los refugiados o los inmigrantes son una proporcionan talento y de cierta manera no siempre va a ser tan masivo, sino pueden ser altos o bajos en números de inmigración, pero lo que ella recomienda es prepararse para saber acomodar a los refugiados. Los Estados Unidos no reciben proporcionalmente la cantidad de refugiados como deberían o como lo hacen otras naciones, pero sin embargo se ve que tienen algún control en cuanto a ellos.
All right, Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for joining us. This is a topic that is of great interest to our listeners in multiple countries. Congratulations on the new book, and well, obviously right now nobody's having good times, but again, thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the great questions and for the translation. I appreciate both.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You too.
Ok, nos quedamos ahora con algo de música.